Welcome to temple history. Sleepy, tonight we journey to a place where gods once walked, where footprints carved in stone testify to presence we cannot name, where silence holds mysteries that 3,000 years could not unravel and modern violence could not completely erase. In the northern hills of Syria, where ancient trade routes crossed and empires rose and fell like tides against eternal shores, there stood a temple, not the grandest temple of the ancient world, not the most famous, but perhaps the most mysterious. For the Temple of Ain Dara held evidence of something that should not exist, footprints too large to be human, too deliberately placed to be symbolic, too precisely measured to be accidental. Footprints that suggest beings of impossible scale once crossed these thresholds, leaving only their marks in basalt as testimony to passage we cannot explain. The temple was built sometime in the first millennium before our common era, constructed of dark volcanic stone that resisted time's erosion, decorated with carvings that spoke in visual language we have largely forgotten how to read. It stood on a hill overlooking valleys where olive trees grew and shepherds tended flocks, and life continued in rhythms that seemed eternal because they stretched back beyond memory's reach. The temple served worshippers for centuries, perhaps a millennium or more, before being abandoned, buried beneath accumulating earth, forgotten by all except the villagers who lived nearby and knew vaguely that something sacred had once stood on that hill, even if they no longer remembered what or why. Archaeological excavations in the 20th century uncovered what centuries had hidden, revealed chambers and carvings, measured walls and documented floor plans, and discovered the footprints. The three of them, each nearly 1 meter in length, each positioned as though marking the stride of something that walked through the temple's entrance, across its outer chamber, into its inner sanctum. The footprints were not sculptures placed for veneration, were not symbolic representations meant to evoke divine presence metaphorically. They were carved as though recording actual passage, as though something had walked here, and the builders, discovering these marks, constructed their temple around them, transforming found evidence into architectural theology. We do not know who was worshipped at Ain Dara. The texts that would tell us have not survived. The inscriptions that would identify the deities are absent or too fragmentary to read with certainty. Scholars suggest Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, or perhaps whether gods who commanded storms and brought rain to agricultural lands that depended on heaven's blessing for survival. But these are educated guesses rather than certainties. The truth is we stand before this temple, as before a text written in language we have forgotten we can recognize that it communicates something profound, something sacred, something that mattered enough to be carved in enduring stone. But we cannot read the full message. We can only stand in presence of mystery and acknowledge what we do not know. The temple endured for 3 millennia, survived the collapse of the Bronze Age civilizations, weathered the rise of Assyrian Empire and its brutal efficiency, witnessed Babylonian conquest and Persian administration, and Greek cultural dominance and Roman military power, and Byzantine Christianity and Islamic expansion. Each civilization that controlled this region acknowledged the temple's sanctity even when they no longer shared the faith that built it. Each left it largely undisturbed, recognizing that some spaces carry holiness that transcends the particular beliefs that originally consecrated them. The stones weathered, the carvings eroded, but the temple stood as testament to human impulse to create sacred space, to mark the places where divine and mortal realms touched, to build permanence in stone that would outlast the builders and their beliefs, and everything except the mystery itself. But permanence is illusion. What survives 3,000 years can be destroyed in moments. In January 2018, the Temple of Ain Dara was struck during military operations in northern Syria's ongoing conflict. The ancient stones shattered. The footprints that had marked divine passage for millennia were buried beneath rubble. The temple that had endured everything time could inflict fell to modern explosives that recognized no sanctity, acknowledged no heritage, saw in ancient stones only positions to be denied to enemies in a war that had already consumed so much of Syria's irreplaceable past. The destruction was not complete erasure. The temple exists now in photographs and measured drawings, in archaeological reports and scholarly articles, in digital archives and academic memory. We can still encounter the mystery, even though we cannot stand in the physical space, can still see images of the footprints even though we cannot trace their outline with our fingers, can still study the carvings even though they exist now as fragments rather than as integrated whole. The preservation through documentation is partial, is shadow of the original, but shadow is better than complete darkness, is testament to human effort to hold onto what violence and time try to take from us. Tonight we explore this temple that no longer stands. Examine the footprints that no longer wait in their basalt thresholds. Consider the mysteries that documentation preserves even when physical form is lost. We move slowly through chambers that exist now only in memory and archive. Pause before carvings that we can see only in photographs. Stand in presence of absence and understand that sometimes what is lost reveals as much as what is preserved. The Temple of Ain Dara, the footprints that marked divine passage, the sacred space that stood for 3,000 years before falling in moments, the mystery that survives destruction because questions outlive the stones that first prompted them. Let the evening deepen around you. Let your breathing slow to match the ancient rhythms of temple ritual, of pilgrims approaching sacred ground, of priests maintaining mysteries they did not fully comprehend but faithfully preserved. We begin our journey to a place that no longer exists except in the realm where memory and meaning dwell. To footprints carved in stone that marked passage we cannot explain. To silence that holds questions we cannot answer. To mystery that endures beyond temples and beyond time. The journey begins. The temple waits, not in physical form, but in the sacred space where all lost things continue to exist, where questions live forever, where footprints in stone still testify to presence we cannot name. The journey, the mystery, the temple, all waiting in the darkness where memory dwells. In the beginning there is only stone. Basalt formed from ancient lava flows, volcanic rock cooled and hardened into material that resists both erosion and explanation. Dark stone, dense stone, stone chosen deliberately because it would endure, because what was carved into it would last, because the message, whatever the message, was needed to survive across centuries that would become millennia. And carved into this basalt, at the entrance to what would become a temple, there appeared a footprint. Not a symbolic representation of a foot, not an artistic interpretation, but an actual footprint carved as though recording something that had pressed into this stone, leaving its impression for reasons we can only guess. The footprint measures 1 meter in length. Measure this yourself if you need to understand the scale. Place your own foot beside a meter stick and see how small human feet are in comparison. See how impossible this measurement becomes when you try to imagine the being whose foot would create such an impression. Calculate the proportions. If the foot is 1 meter, the full height would be approximately 3 to 4 meters. Giants, or gods, or something between beings whose physical scale matched their spiritual authority, whose presence was literally larger than life, whose passage through this threshold left mark that would outlast empires and outlive the very faith that venerated them. The footprint is carved with attention to anatomical detail. Shows toes, shows the ball of the foot and the heel, shows the arch and the outline with precision that suggests the carver was working from something real rather than from imagination. This is not stylized representation, but documentary evidence, the stone equivalent of a photograph, capturing specific details of specific feet that belonged to specific being whose identity we have lost. The precision troubles us, makes the mystery more acute. Because if this were merely symbolic, if the footprint were meant only to evoke divine presence metaphorically, why such exactness? Why measure and carve with such care? Why create something that looks less like art and more like evidence? We do not know when the footprint was carved. Do not know if it preceded the temple or was created as part of the temple's construction, or was added later as the cult developed and myths accumulated. But we know that the temple was built around it. The entrance was positioned to incorporate this footprint into the threshold experience. Pilgrims approaching would see it, would understand before crossing that they were walking where something divine had walked, would place their own small feet near this enormous impression and feel the scale of difference between mortal and divine made physical and undeniable. The footprint was not decoration, was essential element of the temple's theology, was the foundation literal and metaphorical upon which the entire sacred structure was raised. But this first footprint is not alone. 3 meters forward, deeper into the temple's outer chamber, there is a second footprint. Same size, same anatomical precision, same disturbing reality of being too exact to dismiss as mere symbolism. The positioning suggests continuation the first step, and then the second step, the stride of something walking with deliberate purpose from outside to inside, from profane space to sacred space, from arrival to deeper penetration of the sanctuary. The distance between footprints matches what the stride would be for a being of such scale, matches what we would expect if something actually walked here rather than if an artist arranged symbolic representations. And then, in the inner sanctum, in the Holy of Holies where only priests could enter, where the divine presence was understood to dwell most intensely, there is the third footprint, the final mark, the destination. Here the stride stops. Here the walking becomes dwelling. Here the evidence suggests not passage through but arrival at, not movement toward but presence within. The third footprint marks this chamber as the goal, as the place where whatever walked through the entrance and across the outer chamber chose to remain, to occupy, to make this specific space the locus of divine presence. 3 footprints, 3 points marking a sacred geography we can trace but cannot fully understand. Some scholars suggest the footprints represent the goddess Ishtar, who was worshipped widely in this region during the first millennium BCE. Others propose storm gods whose power over weather made them essential deities for agricultural societies dependent on rain. But these identifications are speculative. Our attempts to fit the physical evidence into the mythological frameworks we know from texts that survive. The truth is simpler and more mysterious. We do not know whose feet these were, cannot name the being they represent, cannot access the myths that would explain their presence. We have only the footprints themselves carved with impossible precision, positioned with deliberate intent, marking presence we cannot identify. The footprints raise questions that cascade into deeper mysteries. If these represent divine feet, why carve them rather than construct statues of the gods themselves? If they mark actual passage, if something walked here, what was it? When did it walk? Why did it leave only footprints rather than other evidence? And most troubling, if the temple builders discovered these marks already present in the stone and built their sanctuary around them, what does that suggest about the origin of the footprints? About the possibility that something was here before the temple, that these marks predate human construction, that we are witnessing evidence of encounter rather than creation. We cannot answer these questions, can only stand in presence of mystery and acknowledge what we do not know. The footprints existed in physical stone for 3,000 years, exist now in photographs and documentation. They testify to something, to belief at minimum, to the conviction of ancient worshippers that this place was sacred because divine feet had marked it, to possibility at maximum, to the chance that we do not understand everything about the ancient world, that some of what seems impossible to us was experienced as real by those who came before. That mystery is not always the absence of explanation, but sometimes the presence of something that defies our categories of understanding. The footprints that walked through stone, the marks that measured 1 meter in length, the evidence carved with impossible precision. The mystery that begins with these impressions in basalt and radiates outward into questions about faith and reality, about what the ancients knew and what we have forgotten, about presence that left only these silent witnesses. We trace the outline with our minds, feel the weight they imply, stand at the threshold they marked, and understand that crossing here meant entering territory where normal rules dissolved, where the divine pressed close enough to leave marks, where stone itself became testimony to encounter that words have not preserved. The footprints, the beginning, the mystery carved in basalt shadow, forever waiting for the return of something that may have never truly left. The first silence, the foundational question, the footprints that walked through stone. Every sacred journey begins with crossing, with moving from one realm to another, with the moment when you step from ordinary world into sacred space and feel the transition in your body, in your breathing, in the quality of silence that surrounds you. At Ain Dara, this crossing was not subtle, was not marked only by ritual or by mental preparation, was physical threshold carved from basalt, defined by guardian figures, marked by the first footprint that testified to divine passage. To approach the temple was to approach this boundary. To enter was to cross where gods had crossed. To move from profane to sacred through doorway that held evidence of the divine already present, already having made this passage, already having sanctified this transition through prior crossing. The threshold in ancient temples was never merely architectural necessity, was not simply the boundary between inside and outside. the structural element that supported walls and roof. The threshold was theological geography, was the seam between earth and heaven, was the meeting point of mortal time and sacred eternity, was the dangerous boundary where divine and human realms touched, and where that touching could illuminate or destroy depending on the purity of the one who crossed. Ancient worshippers understood this instinctively, understood that entering sacred space required preparation, required ritual cleansing, required proper mental state, required becoming worthy of crossing. Because threshold did not protect the sacred from the profane, threshold tested whether the crosser was ready for what lay beyond. At Ain Dara, the threshold carried additional weight, carried the first footprint. The mark that testified this was not arbitrary boundary chosen by human architects, but was sanctified ground selected by divine presence. The footprint proved it, showed that something divine had crossed here first, had established this as the proper entrance, had marked this specific point as the place where movement from outside to inside was appropriate, was blessed, was the path that gods themselves had validated through their own passage. Pilgrims approaching would see this evidence, would understand that they were following in divine footsteps, literally placing their feet in the path that divine feet had walked, crossing threshold that divine passage had consecrated. The guardian figures flanking the entrance reinforced threshold's significance. Stone lions carved in relief along the outer walls, sphinxes with human heads and lion bodies and sometimes wings, suggesting their liminal nature creatures that combined human intelligence with leonine power and capacity for flight that transcended earthly limitations. These were not decorations, were theological statements, were witnesses that observed all who crossed, were protectors that guarded not against physical threats, but against spiritual unreadiness, against approaching sacred space while still carrying profane consciousness, against crossing without proper reverence. The guardians did not need to move or speak. Their presence was sufficient, was reminder that this boundary mattered, that crossing required transformation, that entering here meant accepting you would not return unchanged. Lions in ancient Near Eastern iconography carried specific meanings, were associated with royalty and divine authority, were creatures that existed between wild nature and civilized order, powerful enough to be dangerous, magnificent enough to inspire awe, but present enough in human landscape to be known rather than merely imagined. Lions guarded thresholds because they themselves were threshold creatures, were neither fully wild nor fully tamed, embodied the same dangerous sanctity that characterized sacred spaces, could be benevolent or destructive depending on how they were approached, commanded respect through inherent authority rather than through demonstrated force, The threshold at Ain Dara was carved from single massive stone. Was basalt chosen for its durability and its visual weight? Was dark stone that contrasted with lighter stone of surrounding walls? Was deliberately made substantial, made thick enough and heavy enough that crossing it was physical act that required intentional step up and over? Was designed to make the crossing conscious, to prevent accidental entry, to ensure that moving from outside to inside required deliberate choice, deliberate movement, deliberate acceptance of what that crossing meant. Modern doorways are designed for ease of passage. We glide through them, barely noticing the transition. Ancient thresholds were designed to make passage difficult, to slow you down, to force awareness of the boundary you were crossing. Pilgrims would pause at this threshold, would perform rituals we can only guess at, perhaps removing sandals, perhaps washing hands or feet, perhaps speaking prayers or making offerings, would prepare themselves mentally and spiritually for what lay beyond, would look at the footprint and understand that they were about to follow in divine path, would feel fear, perhaps the proper sacred fear that recognizes proximity to power that could bless or destroy, would feel awe at standing where gods had stood, would feel small beside footprint that dwarfed their own feet, and then would cross, would step over threshold, would leave behind ordinary world and enter sacred space, would become, for duration of their visit to the temple, something different from what they were in ordinary life, would become worshippers, pilgrims, suppliants approaching divine presence with hope and fear and reverence all mixed together. The crossing was not just entry, was commitment. Once you crossed threshold marked by divine footprint, flanked by guardian lions, carved from basalt that had witnessed centuries of such crossings, you were declaring yourself. Were stating through action that you accepted the sacred nature of this space. Were acknowledging that divine presence dwelt here. Were submitting yourself to the authority of whatever gods this temple served. Were entering into relationship with the divine that could not be undone simply by crossing back, because you could leave the temple, but you could not uncross the threshold, could not return to complete ignorance of what lay beyond, could not unknow that gods walked in stone and left their marks for mortals to follow. We stand at this threshold now only in imagination. The physical threshold is buried beneath rubble. The footprint that marked it is lost. The guardian lions are fragmented. But the meaning remains. The understanding that sacred space requires boundaries, that approaching the divine requires crossing from ordinary to extraordinary, that some thresholds are not just architectural features, but are theological statements about the nature of reality, about the existence of realms beyond the everyday, about the possibility of encounter between mortal and divine, about the human need to mark and honor, and approach with proper reverence the places where heaven touches earth. The threshold where gods once stood, where the first footprint waited, where crossing meant transformation, where entry required courage and reverence and acceptance of mystery. The doorway, the boundary, the sacred threshold, forever marking the difference between profane and sacred, forever holding the first footprint, forever witnessing the passage between worlds. Stone does not sleep. Stone does not tire. Stone guardians can maintain their watch across millennia without rest, without diminishment, without the failure of attention that living guards eventually suffer. At Ain Dara, lions carved in relief along the temple's outer walls have stood watch since the temple's construction, have witnessed every approach, every crossing, every pilgrim who came seeking divine encounter. Their mouths are closed. Their poses suggest not aggression but eternal vigilance. They do not threaten visitors. They witness them. They mark the boundary between profane and sacred through their silent presence. They remind all who approach that this crossing requires transformation, that to pass between these stone guardians is to accept that you will not return unchanged. The lion in the ancient Near East was both real and symbolic. Lions lived in the region where actual animals that could be encountered, hunted, feared. But lions were also symbols that carried meanings beyond their biological reality. Were associated with kingship, because kings hunted lions to demonstrate courage and authority. Were associated with divine power because of their strength and majesty. Were associated with guardianship because their presence marked boundaries, the boundary between wild and civilized, between dangerous and safe, between what could be controlled and what remained beyond human dominion. To place lions at temple entrance was to invoke all these meanings simultaneously, was to say this space is protected by power that is real, that is dangerous if approached wrongly, that commands respect through inherent authority. At Ain Dara, the lions are carved with attention to anatomical detail, show musculature and posture that suggest knowledge of actual lions, show manes and paws and the weight-bearing stance of resting big cats. But they are also stylized, are rendered according to artistic conventions that make them recognizable as part of a tradition, as expressing meaning through form that would have been understood by ancient viewers who knew this visual vocabulary. The balance between realism and stylization is deliberate, makes the lions real enough to inspire appropriate fear, while symbolic enough to carry theological meaning beyond their physical form. The positioning of the lions is precise. They flank the entrance symmetrically, create visual balance that draws the eye toward the central doorway, create awareness of being watched as you approach, of passing between these eternal guardians whose stone eyes track your movement even though they do not move. The positioning also creates psychological effect, makes you feel smaller as you pass between them, makes you aware of being evaluated, makes you question whether you are worthy of entering. The lions do not speak, do not challenge visitors directly. But their presence asks the question that every sacred threshold asks. Are you ready for what lies beyond? Have you prepared yourself properly? Do you approach with appropriate reverence? Guardians in ancient temples served multiple functions, were physical deterrents against unauthorized entry, were symbolic statements about the power of the gods worshipped within, were theological teachings about the nature of sacred space and what approaching it required. At Ain Dara, the lions served all these functions. Would have deterred casual visitors, would have communicated through their presence that this was not public space open to all, but was sacred territory that demanded respect. Would have declared the power of the deities worshipped here. Any god who commanded such guardians must be powerful, must be worthy of worship, must be approached with proper fear and reverence. Would have taught pilgrims about what sacred space required, about the need to transform themselves before crossing, to leave behind profane consciousness and ordinary concerns, to approach with minds and hearts focused on divine encounter rather than on mundane matters. But guardians also served protective function in reverse direction, protected sacred space, not just from improper intrusion, but protected visitors from the sacred itself. Because divine presence is dangerous, is power that can overwhelm, can destroy as easily as bless. The guardians marked threshold not just to keep unworthy out, but to warn those who entered that they were approaching something powerful, something that required careful approach, something that could not be encountered casually without risk. The lions protected pilgrims by slowing them down, by forcing awareness, by creating the pause before crossing that allowed preparation and proper mental framing of what the crossing meant. Some ancient texts describe lions as creatures that never sleep, that maintain constant vigilance, that guard without ceasing. Whether this was believed literally or understood metaphorically, the meaning is clear. These guardians are eternal, are not subject to human limitations of fatigue or distraction, will be watching always, will maintain their protection and their witness across centuries and millennia. And at Ain Dara this proved true. The lions stood watch through the rise and fall of empires, through changes of faith and culture and political authority, through centuries when the temple was active and centuries when it was abandoned, through archaeological excavation and documentation and study, stood watch until the moment bombs fell and ancient stones shattered, and the eternal guardians finally fell. The symbolism of guardian lions appears across ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean civilizations, appears at Mycenaean citadels like the Lion Gate, appears at Hittite temple entrances, appears in Assyrian palace reliefs, appears in Babylonian processional ways. The widespread use suggests these were not local symbols, but were part of shared cultural vocabulary, were understood across regions and epochs as appropriate markers of sacred or royal space. The specific style varied. The artistic conventions differed, but the essential meaning remained constant. Lions mark boundaries that matter. Lions guard thresholds between ordinary and extraordinary. Lions witness crossings and ensure those who cross are worthy. At Ain Dara, the lions guarded a gate that is now forgotten. The temple they protected is destroyed. The pilgrims they witnessed have been dead for millennia. The faith they served has dissolved into history. But the image of the lions remains in photographs and drawings, in archaeological documentation, in scholarly studies, in the continued human recognition that some spaces require guardians, that some boundaries need marking, that the distinction between sacred and profane matters enough to carve it in stone that will outlast the faith itself. The lions that guard forgotten gates, the stone watchers who never slept, the eternal witnesses to crossings that happened 3,000 years ago and that continue to happen now in imagination and memory. The guardians, the boundary markers, the witnesses who saw all who crossed and judged silently whether crossing was worthy. The lions, forever watching, forever guarding, forever marking the threshold between worlds, silent, eternal, stone guardians of gates that lead to mysteries we have not forgotten even though the gates themselves are lost. Along the inner walls of the Temple of Ain Dara, running like text carved in stone, are panels called orthostats, upright slabs decorated with relief carvings that tell stories we can see but cannot completely read. These are not random decorations, are not artistic embellishments added for aesthetic pleasure, are narrative frozen in stone. Our visual scripture meant to be read by pilgrims who moved through the temple's chambers. Our myths made visible. Our theological teachings carved in basalt so they would endure beyond the fragility of memory and the impermanence of spoken tradition. But the language has been lost. The myths that gave these images their full meaning have fragmented, and we are left with carvings whose power we can feel but whose complete message remains partially veiled, whispered rather than spoken clearly, suggested rather than declared. Basalt is volcanic stone, is born from Earth's molten heart, is liquid rock cooled and hardened into material that resists erosion and endures across millennia. The choice to carve in basalt rather than in softer limestone was deliberate, was statement about permanence, was commitment to preserving these images and the teachings they contained across generations and centuries, was understanding that what was carved here mattered enough to be recorded in material that would outlast the builders and their civilization, and every empire that would rise and fall in this region. The hardness of basalt also meant carving was difficult, required skilled craftspeople, required time and effort and resources. The investment itself testified to importance. You do not carve in basalt casually. You carve in basalt when you intend the message to last forever. The carvings show beings that combine elements we recognize from nature, but in combinations that nature does not produce. Sphinxes with human heads and lion bodies. Griffins with eagle heads and lion bodies, and sometimes wings that suggest celestial origins. Lamashu with human faces and bull bodies and wings that mark them as divine messengers or guardians. These hybrid forms were not imaginary monsters, were theological statements, were attempts to express divine attributes through visual combination of powerful symbols. The human head suggested intelligence and consciousness. The lion body suggested strength and royal authority. The wings suggested transcendence and connection to heavenly realms. Combining these elements created image of being that possessed all these qualities, that was intelligent and powerful and divine, that could move between earth and heaven, that embodied attributes that humans associated with gods. The orthostats also show processions, lines of figures bearing offerings, approaching altars, presenting gifts to seated deities whose larger scale marks their divine status. These processional scenes served as visual instruction manual, showed pilgrims how worship should be conducted, what offerings were appropriate, how to approach the divine presence with proper reverence and correct ritual gestures. The carvings modeled behavior, taught through example what words might not communicate as effectively. A pilgrim entering the temple and seeing these processional reliefs would understand immediately what was expected, would see the proper posture and placement and progression, would learn through looking rather than through listening. But much of the visual language remains opaque to modern viewers. We can identify general categories, can recognize figures bearing offerings, can identify hybrid creatures, can see scenes of worship and ritual. But the nuances escape us. The specific meanings that different postures or positions or combinations would have carried for ancient viewers who knew this symbolic vocabulary are largely lost. We see carvings, but read them only partially. Like encountering text in language we recognize as language but cannot fully translate. We know these images communicated something precise and important, but the precision has degraded into approximation. The certainty has dissolved into educated guessing. Some orthostats are missing, were removed in antiquity or have been destroyed by time's erosion, or were damaged during the temple's final destruction. The gaps create narrative interruptions, create stories that begin but do not conclude. Create sequences where we can see the opening and perhaps the middle, but the ending is lost. The incompleteness is frustrating, is reminder that what survives is accident as much as intention. That preservation depends on circumstances beyond our control. That even basalt, even volcanic stone chosen for its durability, eventually fails, eventually fractures, eventually loses to time or violence what it was meant to preserve eternally. The positioning of the orthostats was deliberate, created a sequence that pilgrims would encounter as they moved through temple chambers. The outer orthostats might show more public scenes, processions, offerings, general worship. The inner orthostats might show more esoteric content, mythological scenes, divine actions, cosmological teachings. The progression was pedagogical, was designed to educate gradually, to reveal deeper mysteries as worshippers moved deeper into sacred space, to reserve the most sacred imagery for those who had crossed the outer thresholds and proven their devotion by progressing this far into the temple's interior. Some orthostats show violence, show gods defeating enemies, show cosmic battles, show order overcoming chaos. These are not merely historical records, are theological statements about divine power and about the gods' role in maintaining cosmic order against forces that threaten to return creation to primordial disorder. The violence is not gratuitous, is necessary, is the price of maintaining the world in which humans can live. The carvings taught that divine power was not only benevolent but was also terrible. That gods who protected could also destroy. That approaching the divine required understanding both aspects, the blessing and the danger, the grace and the wrath, the creation and the destruction. The craftsmanship visible in the orthostats is remarkable. Shows attention to detail that suggests the carvers were highly skilled specialists. Shows consistency in style that suggests workshop traditions passed down across generations. Shows variations in quality that suggest multiple hands working over extended period. The best carvings show subtlety in the modeling of forms, show how cloth drapes, how muscles flex, how faces express emotion. Show mastery of the medium that allowed stone to appear almost fluid. The lesser carvings are more rigid but still competent, still communicate their messages, still participate in the visual narrative that the orthostats collectively created. We stand before these carvings now only in photographs and drawings. The originals are destroyed or scattered or buried beneath rubble. But even in documentation, they retain power, still communicate across the millennia, still testify to the conviction of those who carved them, the conviction that these images mattered, that these teachings needed to be preserved, that visual language could carry sacred meaning from generation to generation. The orthostats that whisper in basalt, The panels that hold stories we can see but cannot fully understand. The sacred narrative carved in volcanic stone. The visual scripture that teaches even when we cannot read every word. The carvings that witnessed centuries of pilgrims and that witnessed, finally, the temple's destruction. Forever speaking in language that memory has partially forgotten. Forever testifying to faith that expressed itself in stone. Forever the narrative that continues whispering even when we cannot hear every word. The orthostats, the whispers, the basalt testimony. Forever. Beyond the entrance, past the guardian lions, through the threshold marked by divine footprints, across the outer courtyard where pilgrims gathered and offerings were presented, through doorways that progressively narrowed and darkened. There lay the inner chamber, the Holy of Holies, the adytum, the most sacred space within the temple where divine presence was understood to dwell most intensely, most immediately, most dangerously. This chamber was not accessible to all. Was restricted to priests who had been consecrated for this service, who had been trained in the proper rituals, who understood how to approach divine presence without being overwhelmed or destroyed by proximity to power that mortal beings were not meant to fully encounter. The chamber is small, measures perhaps 5 meters by 6 meters, is intimate rather than grand, is designed not for crowds but for singular encounter, for the priest alone with the divine, for the moment of meeting stripped of all witness except the gods themselves. The walls are thick basalt. The ceiling would have been wooden beams long since decayed, leaving no physical trace, but leaving logical necessity that the chamber was covered, was enclosed, was separated from sky and therefore from the ordinary world that continued above while sacred mysteries occurred in this confined darkness below. Light would have been minimal, would have come from oil lamps that priests carried or from small windows near the ceiling that allowed only filtered illumination. The darkness was intentional, was part of the chamber's theology. Darkness separated this space from daylit world outside. Darkness created atmosphere of mystery. Darkness limited vision, so that other senses heightened, so that you felt the presence rather than saw it, so that encounter happened in realm beyond visual confirmation, so that faith became necessary because sight was insufficient. Ancient peoples understood what we sometimes forget. That divine encounter happens best not in clarity, but in shadows where certainty dissolves and mystery can be felt rather than analyzed. On the floor of this inner chamber, positioned in the precise center, rests the third footprint, the final mark, the destination toward which the divine stride was directed. This footprint differs from the first two not in size or shape, but in meaning. The first footprint marked arrival, marked the crossing from outside to inside, from profane to sacred. The second marked progression, marked movement deeper into temple space, commitment to approaching the divine presence. But the third marks dwelling, marks the choice to remain rather than to pass through, marks this specific point as the locus of divine presence, as the spot where gods chose to be found, as the place where meeting between mortal and divine could occur because the divine had sanctified it through presence marked in stone. We imagine the priest entering this chamber, approaching with reverence and fear mixed together in proportions that we who live in secular age struggle to comprehend, carrying offerings, speaking prayers, moving slowly in darkness barely relieved by flickering lamplight, seeing the footprint and understanding that he stands in the exact place where God stood, that his small mortal feet occupy the same ground that divine feet marked. The psychological impact would have been overwhelming, would have created sense of proximity to power that was both desired and terrifying, would have fulfilled the purpose of all sacred architecture to create space where divine and mortal could meet, where encounter could happen, where the veil between realms grew thin enough that passage was possible. The chamber was acoustically isolated. The thick walls would have muted sounds from outside, would have created silence that felt absolute. That felt like the silence before creation, the silence that existed before divine word spoke worlds into being. Ancient peoples understood silence as sacred, understood that God spoke not in noise, but in the quiet that follows noise, in the stillness that allows attention to focus completely, in the absence of distraction where presence becomes palpable. The inner chamber's silence was not absence of sound, but was presence of the divine made audible through the very lack of human noise. What rituals occurred in this chamber we can only guess. Texts that would describe the ceremonies have not survived. We can reconstruct general patterns from comparative evidence from descriptions of temple ritual in other Near Eastern cultures, from references in texts that mention, but do not detail worship practices. Probably incense was burned. Probably prayers were spoken. Probably offerings were presented. Probably there were moments of silence where the priest waited for divine response, for sign or omen or internal conviction that prayers had been heard and offerings accepted. The specific words, the precise gestures, the detailed theology that gave these actions their meaning all lost. The chamber served as axis mundi, as cosmic center, where earth and heaven intersected, where divine realm pressed close enough to mortal realm that passage between them became possible, where the priest became mediator, became the one who stood in both realms simultaneously, became the conduit through which divine will could be communicated to mortal community, and mortal needs could be presented to divine attention. The architectural space created the possibility. The thick walls and darkness and isolation created the conditions, but the encounter itself remained mystery, remained beyond architectural determinism, remained something that could be facilitated but not forced, remained the province of the divine who chose whether to manifest, whether to respond, whether to grant the meeting that the architecture made possible. The inner chamber exists now only in documentation. The walls are broken. The ceiling is gone. The darkness has been replaced by exposure to open sky, a violation of sacred space as complete as any intentional desecration could achieve. But the memory of the chamber remains. The understanding that some spaces are sacred precisely because they exclude, because they create boundaries, because they maintain mystery through restriction, because they acknowledge that not all truths are public truths, that not all knowledge should be widely shared, that some encounters are meant to occur in solitude and silence and sacred darkness, where only the divine and the dedicated can meet. The inner chamber where silence dwells, where the third footprint marks the presence, where darkness creates conditions for sacred encounter, where walls thick enough to hold out world create space protected enough for divine meeting, where the priest alone approached mysteries that congregation could participate in only indirectly, only through mediator, only through accepting that some things remain forever beyond direct access for any except those consecrated specifically for this service. The chamber, the silence, the footprint, the sacred darkness, forever the holy of holies, forever the place where gods chose to dwell, forever the inner sanctum that required crossing multiple thresholds, passing multiple guardians, accepting multiple restrictions before arriving at the center where the divine waited. The silence, the dwelling, the presence marked in stone, forever sacred, forever the chamber where silence itself becomes presence, forever. The footprints measure 1 meter in length. This is not estimation, not approximation, not symbolic measurement, is actual physical dimension that can be verified in archaeological documentation. 1 meter, approximately 39 inches, longer than any human foot by factors that make the comparison absurd. If we calculate proportions, if we use standard ratios of foot size to body height, we arrive at beings between 3 and 4 meters tall, 10 to 13 feet. Giants whose physical scale would have dwarfed any human who approached their footprints, who would have towered over the tallest mortals, whose presence would have been overwhelming not just spiritually, but physically, would have required looking up at impossible angles, would have made worshippers feel the scale of difference between divine and mortal, made manifest, in size difference too large to ignore. But here is the central mystery, the question that deepens the longer we contemplate it. We do not know whose feet these were. do not know which gods or goddesses these footprints represent, cannot identify the beings whose passage these marks record. We can guess, can speculate, can propose possibilities based on what we know of ancient Near Eastern religion, can suggest Ishtar, goddess of love and war, whose cult was prominent in this region, can propose Hadad or Baal, storm gods whose control over weather made them essential to agricultural peoples, can name any number of deities who were worshipped in first millennium Syria, but we cannot prove any identification, cannot match these footprints to any specific myth, cannot find the texts that would tell us whose divine feet measured 1 meter in length. The absence of certain identification is remarkable. Ancient peoples were meticulous about religious identity, were careful to name their gods, to distinguish between deities, to maintain clear theological categories. Temples were dedicated to specific gods whose names were inscribed on foundation stones, carved into dedication texts, repeated in prayers and hymns. But at Ain Dara, no such inscriptions survive. No texts identify the deity worshipped here. No foundation deposits name the gods to whom this temple was consecrated. We have only the footprints' anonymous evidence of divine presence that refuses to be categorized, refuses to be named, refuses to fit neatly into the religious frameworks we think we understand. The anonymity suggests several possibilities. Perhaps the inscriptions existed, but have been lost, destroyed by time, or by iconoclasts who removed identifying marks while leaving the physical structure largely intact. Perhaps the temple served multiple deities, and the footprints represented generic divine presence rather than specific God. Perhaps the tradition was oral rather than written. Perhaps everyone who worshipped here knew whose footprints these were, but never felt need to record it in permanent form, because the knowledge seemed too obvious to require preservation. Or perhaps, most intriguingly, perhaps even the ancient worshippers did not know. Perhaps they discovered these footprints already carved in stone and built their temple around them, worshipping presence they could not name, venerating mystery they could not fully explain. In ancient Near Eastern mythology, giants appear in fragments. The Nephilim of Hebrew scripture, beings born from union of divine beings and human women, described as mighty warriors of old, as beings of renown, but never fully explained, never given complete mythology. The Anunnaki of Sumerian tablets, divine beings whose exact nature and role shifts depending on text and period, sometimes appearing as gods, sometimes as divine servants, sometimes as beings who move between heavenly and earthly realms. But these fragmentary references do not match the footprints at Ain Dara, do not explain 1 meter feet, Do not provide myths that would account for why such beings would walk through a temple, leaving only their marks as testimony. The footprints suggest the existence of traditions that died without being recorded, of myths that were carried orally until the final speakers fell silent, of religious beliefs that seemed so obvious to their practitioners that recording them seemed unnecessary until the culture changed, the language shifted, the memories faded, and what had been common knowledge became lost knowledge. What has been lost? The recognition that our preserved texts represent tiny fraction of ancient thought, that most myths and beliefs and theological ideas were never written down, were lost when oral traditions ceased to transmit them. The footprints at Ain Dara are evidence of this loss, our testimony to gods whose worship was real, whose temples were built, whose rituals were performed, but whose names have been erased from memory. The namelessness creates particular kind of mystery. We can visit ruins of temples to Zeus and know we are standing in space dedicated to specific god with specific mythology and attributes. Can study Egyptian temples and identify Amun or Ra or Isis, and access myths that explain their significance. But at Ain Dara, we stand before evidence of worship without certainty about who was worshipped. Stand in presence of the divine that refuses to be named. That exists in our understanding only as absence, as the gap in knowledge, as the silence in the record, as the unanswered question carved in stone. The mystery is not what the footprints are. We can see they are footprints, can measure their dimensions. The mystery is whose they were, what divine being they marked, what myths explained them, what traditions venerated them. We imagine the pilgrims who worshipped here over centuries, who brought offerings, who spoke prayers, who walked past these footprints and knew or thought they knew whose divine feet had left these marks, who felt connection to specific gods whose names they could speak, whose myths they could recite, whose favor they sought through proper ritual. And we feel the distance between their certainty and our uncertainty, between their knowledge and our ignorance, between the living tradition they participated in and the dead fragments we try to resurrect from stone and speculation. The giants who left no names. The divine beings whose feet measured 1 meter. The gods who walked through stone and left only silence as identity. Forever present through their marks. Forever absent through lack of names. Forever the mystery that the footprints embody evidence of presence we cannot deny but cannot identify. The nameless giants. The footprints without attribution. The divine presence that refuses identification. Forever walking through our questions. Forever leaving only mystery carved in basalt. Forever. For 3,000 years the Temple of Ain Dara stood. Count those years if you can truly comprehend the span. 3,000 years, 30 centuries, 100 generations. time enough for languages to be born and die, for empires to rise and fall and be forgotten, for technologies to be invented and lost and reinvented, for religions to emerge and spread and be supplanted by others, for the entire map of human civilization to be redrawn multiple times. And through it all, through 3 millennia of transformation and upheaval, the temple stood. The basalt walls endured. The footprints waited. The guardian lions kept their watch. The orthostats continued their stone narrative. The inner chamber held its sacred darkness. Time eroded. Time weathered. But time could not erase. The temple witnessed the collapse of Bronze Age civilizations around 1200 BCE. Witnessed the disruption of trade networks and the disappearance of writing systems and the fall of great kingdoms. Saw refugees fleeing destroyed cities. Saw new peoples moving into regions where old powers had ruled. Saw the world it was built for dissolve and be replaced by something different. But the temple survived the transition, was maintained or at least not destroyed, remained standing through the chaos that ended the Bronze Age and gave birth to the Iron Age that would produce the classical civilizations we know better. The temple stood through Assyrian expansion, through the brutal efficiency of Assyrian military machine that conquered territory from Mesopotamia to Egypt, through campaigns that destroyed cities and relocated populations and redrew political boundaries across the ancient Near East. Assyrian kings claimed to burn temples of conquered peoples, claimed to carry away divine statues as proof of victory. But Ain Dara survived, perhaps because it was remote enough to escape direct attention. Perhaps because even conquerors recognized some spaces as too sacred to violate. Perhaps because Assyrian policy was more complex than propaganda suggested permitted local religious practices to continue under imperial oversight. Whatever the reason, the temple endured. The temple witnessed Babylonian rise, witnessed Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns, and the fall of Jerusalem, and the exile of peoples who would transform their suffering into scripture, witnessed Persian conquest of Babylon, and the establishment of empire larger than any before it, witnessed Alexander's campaigns and the spread of Greek culture that would transform the ancient world, witnessed Rome's expansion and the Pax Romana that brought order at the cost of subjugation. Each empire left its mark on the region. Each brought new languages, new customs, new gods, but the old temple remained as witness to continuity amid change, remained as testimony that some things endure beyond political transformations. The temple stood through the rise of Christianity, through the transformation of Roman Empire into Christian Empire, through the construction of churches and the prohibition of pagan worship. saw old gods declared demons and old temples closed or converted, but somehow survived. Perhaps because it was already abandoned by the time Christianity became dominant. Perhaps because it was remote enough to escape the attention of zealots who destroyed more prominent pagan sites. Perhaps because the footprints themselves inspired enough awe that even Christian authorities hesitated to desecrate them. The temple entered its first period of forgetting, no longer actively worshipped, but not yet destroyed, existing in liminal state between sacred and mundane. The temple stood through Islamic expansion, through the transformation of the Middle East from Christian to Muslim majority, through dynasties that rose and fell: Umayyad, Abbasid, Fatimid, Seljuk, Ottoman, through crusades and Mongol invasions and all the upheavals of medieval and early modern periods, was buried gradually beneath accumulating earth debris and dust settling over centuries, raising the ground level, covering walls and carvings, concealing the temple beneath new surface that erased it from living memory, but paradoxically protected it from intentional destruction. What had been standing architecture became buried archaeology. What had been public space became hidden mystery waiting for rediscovery. Archaeological excavation in the 1950s uncovered what centuries had hidden. French archaeologists working in Syria conducted preliminary surveys, identified the site, began systematic excavation in 1956, uncovered chambers and measured walls, and discovered the footprints, documented the orthostats and the guardian lions, and the architectural details that allowed reconstruction of how the temple had appeared in its ancient glory. The work was painstaking, required careful removal of earth that had accumulated over millennia, required documentation and photography and drawing, required interpretation of what was found. The excavation brought the temple back into knowledge, restored it to academic awareness, made it accessible to scholars who could study and analyze and publish findings that would make Ain Dara known to wider world. Further excavation in the 1980s continued the work, uncovered more of the site, refined earlier interpretations, produced more detailed documentation. The temple was entered into the archaeological record, was recognized as one of most significant examples of Iron Age temple architecture in ancient Near East, was compared to Solomon's temple described in Hebrew Bible, similar dimensions, similar layout, similar use of lions and hybrid creatures as decorative elements. The comparisons were scholarly, were based on careful analysis of architectural features, were not claiming direct connection, but were suggesting common architectural traditions that shaped how sacred space was constructed across the region. The temple became cultural heritage site, was protected, or should have been protected by international agreements that prohibit destruction of archaeological sites during conflict, was designated as part of Syria's national heritage, was studied and written about and photographed, became accessible to anyone who wanted to see images or read scholarly articles, existed in that peculiar modern state where ancient sites exist simultaneously as physical places and as digital information, as stone structures you can visit and as databases you can access remotely. The temple that time could not erase had been preserved not just by endurance, but by documentation, had been saved from forgetting by archaeology and scholarship, and the modern commitment to heritage preservation. But documentation cannot protect against bombs, cannot prevent military strikes that see in ancient stones only strategic positions, cannot preserve against violence that recognizes no sanctity, acknowledges no heritage, sees only tactical advantages and acceptable targets. The temple stood for 3,000 years, survived empires and invasions and the transformation of the ancient world into the medieval and then into the modern, but could not survive civil war, could not survive airstrikes, could not survive being in the wrong place at the wrong time in a conflict that had already destroyed or damaged thousands of Syria's cultural heritage sites. The temple that time could not erase, that endured through 3 millennia, that fell in moments. The irony, the tragedy, the bitter understanding that survival across centuries guarantees nothing, that what lasts 3,000 years can be lost in seconds. The temple, the endurance, the final destruction, the recognition that time is not the only force that erases, that human violence achieves in moments what millennia of weathering could not accomplish. The temple that stood, that endured, that finally fell, forever testament to both human creativity and human destructiveness, forever witness to both preservation and erasure. Forever the temple that time could not erase, but that we erased ourselves. The Temple of Ain Dara was not built in valley or plain, was not constructed at sea level or in lowland where rivers flowed and agriculture flourished, was built on hill, on elevated ground that rose above surrounding landscape, on natural prominence that allowed views across valleys toward distant mountains. The choice was deliberate, was theological statement made in geography and stone, was recognition that sacred space requires elevation, that approaching the divine means ascending, that the journey to meet gods is journey upward from earth toward heaven, from low to high, from the realm where humans dwell to the threshold where divine presence becomes accessible. Mountains in ancient thought were cosmic centers, were the points where earth and heaven met, where gods descended to touch mortal realm, where prayers rose most directly to divine ears. The great mountains of the ancient Near East were all sacred Mount Ararat, where Noah's Ark came to rest, Mount Sinai, where Moses encountered burning bush and received law, Mount Olympus, where Greek gods dwelt, Mount Zaphon, where Baal had his palace. But most people could not travel to these distant peaks, could not make pilgrimage to the truly sacred mountains. So they created artificial mountains, built ziggurats and pyramids and stepped platforms, built temples on hills, created sacred elevation that allowed access to what great mountains represented without requiring journey to actual peaks. At Ain Dara, the hill was natural, was geological feature that existed before humans built upon it. But the choice to build here transformed natural feature into sacred geography, made this hill into axis mundi, into cosmic center, where earth pressed upward toward heaven, and where heaven bent downward toward earth, made elevation meaningful, made climbing the hill into ritual ascent, made the physical effort of approaching the temple into metaphor for spiritual effort of approaching the divine. Pilgrims would have begun their journey in valley below, would have seen temple rising above them, would have understood that reaching it required climb, required effort, required moving from low ground of ordinary life to high ground of sacred encounter. The temple at night would have appeared as silhouette against stars, would have been visible from considerable distance, would have served as orientation point, as landmark that organized landscape around its presence. Travelers seeing it would know where they were, would understand the temple as center around which geography arranged itself. The visibility also meant the temple declared itself, announced its presence, could not be hidden or ignored, was statement of faith visible to all who passed through region, was assertion that the gods worshipped here were powerful enough to merit prominent temple, were significant enough to justify building on height that made the temple visible for miles. Approaching from distance, pilgrims would have experienced progressive revelation, would have seen temple first as shadow against sky, as form without detail, as presence without specifics. Then, as they drew closer, would have begun to distinguish structure, to see walls and entrance, to identify guardian lions, to recognize this was not natural hill, but was built space. Human construction that transformed natural elevation into sacred architecture. The approach was designed to build anticipation, to create time for mental preparation, to allow transition from ordinary consciousness to sacred awareness to happen gradually during physical journey rather than suddenly upon arrival. At night, the temple beneath stars connected earth to cosmos. The ancient Near East had profound astronomical knowledge, understood planetary movements and stellar patterns, could calculate eclipses and predict celestial events. The stars were not distant abstractions, but were immediate presence were gods or divine messengers, were omens that communicated divine will, were eternal witnesses to human affairs. Building temple on elevation meant building under open sky, meant worshipping beneath stars, meant acknowledging that divine realm existed above as well as in inner chamber. That heaven was not distant abstraction, but was visible reality that could be contemplated every clear night. The alignment of temple may have had astronomical significance. Many ancient temples were oriented toward specific celestial phenomena, toward solstice sunrise, or equinox sunset, or rising of particular stars. We do not have enough preserved detail about Ain Dara to determine if such alignments were intentional. But the possibility exists. The possibility that temples' orientation encoded cosmic knowledge, that approaching from correct direction at correct time might align you with celestial phenomena that reinforced temples' connection to divine realm. That architecture and cosmos were integrated in ways we can no longer fully recover. The hill became sacred through human designation, through decision to build here, through centuries of worship that accumulated sanctity, through pilgrims who climbed and priests who served and offerings that were made. The sacredness was not inherent in geology, was not natural property of the hill, was human creation, was meaning imposed through architecture and ritual and belief. But once created, the sacredness became real, became quality that people experienced, became presence that affected those who approached, became more than the sum of stone and earth, became place where divine encounter was possible because community had designated it as such and had maintained that designation across centuries. We imagine the temple beneath stars. Imagine pilgrims completing their climb as day faded to dusk. Imagine them standing at entrance as darkness fell and stars became visible. Imagine them understanding temple as threshold between earth and heaven, as space that participated in both realms, as architecture that grounded divine in physical form, while pointing beyond physical toward transcendent. Imagine them feeling the elevation, feeling the openness to sky, feeling the connection between their worship and the eternal stars that watched, the sacred mountain beneath the stars, the hill that connected earth to heaven, the temple that rose toward divine realm, the elevation that made ascent meaningful, the architecture beneath cosmos, the sacred geography that oriented the world around its presence, forever rising, forever pointing upward, forever the axis around which sacred landscape organized itself, the mountain, the stars, the temple between earth and heaven. Forever the elevation that made approach into ascent, forever the hill that became cosmic center, forever the sacred mountain waiting beneath eternal stars. Language is fragile. Languages die. are spoken for centuries or millennia and then fall silent as last speakers pass away, and no one remains who can read the texts or understand the words. What was once living communication becomes dead inscription, becomes marks on stone or clay that we recognize as language but cannot interpret, cannot access the meanings that flowed so naturally when the language lived. But images survive differently. Images speak across time more successfully than words. We can look at ancient carvings and recognize forms even when we cannot read accompanying texts, can identify animals and humans and gods, can see relationships and actions, can understand at least partially what the images communicate even when precise theological meanings remain obscure. At Ain Dara, the orthostats carried visual language that was more durable than any written text could be. The carvings showed winged bulls, showed protective spirits, showed processions of worshippers bearing offerings, showed hybrid creatures that combined human and animal and divine attributes. Each carving was deliberate, was carved by skilled artisans who knew the conventions, who understood the symbolic vocabulary, who could render in stone the theological teachings that the temple existed to communicate. The carvings were not decoration, were not mere embellishment added to make walls attractive, were scripture, were visual theology, were sacred teachings made visible so they could be transmitted to those who entered the temple. The hybrid creatures were particularly significant. The sphinx with human head and lion body appeared in ancient Near Eastern art for millennia before Ain Dara, represented combination of human intelligence and leonine power, suggested beings that transcended normal boundaries between species, that embodied qualities from multiple sources, that were more than sum of their parts. At Ain Dara, the sphinxes guarded entrances, watched over thresholds, served as protective presences that marked boundaries between profane and sacred space. Their form communicated their function intelligent enough to distinguish between worthy and unworthy visitors, powerful enough to enforce the boundary if necessary. The griffins with eagle heads and lion bodies carried different meanings. Eagles represented celestial realm, represented ability to soar into heaven, represented divine perspective that could see from heights beyond human reach. Lions represented earthly power, represented royal authority, represented strength that could protect or destroy. Combining them created image of being that moved between earth and heaven, that could mediate between realms, that possessed both celestial knowledge and earthly power. The griffins at Ain Dara were not randomly chosen decorations, were theological statements about the nature of divine beings who served the gods, who acted as messengers between divine and mortal realms. The procession scenes showed how worship should be conducted, showed figures in profile walking in orderly lines, showed them bearing offerings carrying vessels and animals, and objects we cannot always identify, showed them approaching altars or divine figures. The scenes were instructional, were visual manuals that taught proper ritual behavior. A pilgrim entering the temple and seeing these processions would understand immediately what was expected. Would see the proper posture formal, reverent, organized. Would see the proper offerings, the appropriate gifts that gods required. Would see the proper progression, the ordered approach that transformed chaotic individual desire into disciplined communal worship. But visual language, like spoken language, requires shared vocabulary to be fully understood. The ancient viewers who looked at these carvings brought knowledge that we lack, brought understanding of mythological references that we cannot access, brought familiarity with ritual practices that we can only partially reconstruct, brought the lived context that gave these images their full meaning. We see the forms but miss the nuances, see the general categories but lose the specific theological points, are like someone who can identify that a text is written in English but cannot read the actual words. We know these images communicate but cannot fully access the communication. Some details escape us entirely. The objects that figures carry in processions, are they vessels for libations or containers for incense or symbolic items, whose meaning was obvious to ancient viewers, but is opaque to us? The gestures that figures make, do they represent specific prayers or ritual actions, or are they conventional poses without specific referent? The relative sizes of figures, does scale represent divine status or social hierarchy, or both or neither? We make educated guesses. Compare with similar scenes from other temples. Reconstruct as best we can, but acknowledge the gaps. Acknowledge what we cannot know. The carving technique itself speaks across time, speaks about the value placed on these images, about the skill required to create them, about the time invested in making sure they would endure. Basalt is hard stone, requires sharp tools and patient work, cannot be carved quickly or carelessly. Each figure, each detail, each line required deliberate effort, required craftspeople who had trained for years to develop the skill, required resources to support those craftspeople while they worked. The investment testified to importance. You do not carve elaborate scenes in basalt unless the message matters, unless you intend it to last, unless you believe future generations will need to see what you create. Some carvings show where hands touched repeatedly, show where fingers traced outlines in gestures of reverence or curiosity or devotion. The wear patterns suggest these were not just viewed, but were engaged with physically, were touched, were incorporated into ritual practice in ways we can no longer reconstruct. The smooth stone where thousands of hands rubbed over centuries testifies to human need to connect physically with sacred images. to not just look but to touch, to make contact across the boundary between mortal and carved representation of divine. We stand before these carvings now in photographs, see them in documentation and scholarly publications, cannot touch the originals because they are destroyed or buried, but we can still recognize the attempt to communicate, can still see the skill and care that went into creation, can still understand that these images mattered, that they taught and testified and transmitted across generations until the final destruction silenced them. The carvings that speak without words, the visual language that transcends the death of spoken languages. The images that communicate across millennia despite the loss of precise meanings. The sacred scripture carved in stone. The visual theology that requires no literacy to encounter. The orthostats that witnessed centuries of pilgrims and that witnessed finally their own destruction. Forever speaking even when we cannot hear every word. Forever teaching even when we cannot understand every lesson. Forever testifying to faith that expressed itself in lasting stone. The carvings, the visual language, the images that speak despite silence, forever. January 20, 2018. The date should be remembered, should be marked as the day when 3,000 years of survival ended in moments, when what time and weather and centuries of human conflict could not destroy finally fell to modern explosives delivered from aircraft conducting military operations in Syria's northern regions. Turkish warplanes struck targets around the town of Afrin. The Temple of Ain Dara was near the strike zone, was damaged. Reports vary about extent. Some say complete destruction. Others say significant damage. Archaeological assessments suggest the structure collapsed, but may not be completely lost. But the essential truth is undeniable. The temple that had stood since Iron Age is no longer standing. The footprints that had waited for 3 millennia are buried beneath rubble. The architectural space that had created possibility of sacred encounter for generation after generation has been violated. The destruction was not targeted cultural erasure, was not deliberate iconoclasm like the demolitions carried out by groups seeking to erase heritage they deemed incompatible with their ideology. The Turkish military was not targeting the temple specifically, was targeting Kurdish positions in area. The temple was collateral damage, was simply in wrong place at wrong time, was near enough to military targets to suffer from strikes not aimed at it, but aimed at enemies who happened to be fighting nearby. The distinction matters little to the stones now broken. The temple is equally destroyed whether destruction was intentional or incidental. The footprints are equally lost, the sacred space equally violated. The news came through social media first, through local reports, through photographs that showed rubble where temple had stood, through satellite imagery that confirmed what ground reports suggested. The archaeological community responded with shock and grief, with statements condemning destruction of cultural heritage, with calls for protection of remaining sites, with documentation of what had been lost. But documentation cannot rebuild, cannot restore what bombs destroyed, cannot return the temple to the state it was in on January 19, 2018, cannot undo what modern warfare achieved in moments. Syria's civil war has devastated the country's cultural heritage, has destroyed or damaged thousands of archaeological sites, has looted museums and stolen artifacts, and erased irreplaceable evidence of human history. Palmyra's ancient temples demolished, Aleppo's historic souk burned, the Crac des Chevaliers damaged by artillery. The damage is catalogued by organizations that monitor cultural heritage destruction. UNESCO designates sites. Satellite imagery documents changes. The scholars publish reports, but the destruction continues. Continues because war recognizes no sanctity, because military necessity overrides cultural value, because ancient stones offer cover for fighters, and because bombs do not distinguish between centuries-old architecture and modern fortifications. The Temple of Ain Dara was not the first Syrian heritage site destroyed in the conflict, will not be the last, is part of pattern that has repeated across years of war. Is one loss among many, but each loss is individual tragedy. Each site destroyed represents knowledge erased, represents connection to past severed, represents human heritage diminished. The temple was unique, was the only site where such footprints existed, was architectural testimony to religious practices we understood only partially, was evidence that will never be available to future generations because it has been buried beneath rubble created by modern conflict. The destruction raises questions about heritage protection during warfare. International law prohibits targeting of cultural heritage sites. The Hague Convention protects cultural property during conflict. UNESCO designations are supposed to provide protection. But protection on paper means nothing when bombs fall, means nothing when military operations prioritize tactical objectives over cultural preservation, means nothing when sites are in conflict zones where international law has long since ceased to be observed by any party. The gap between legal protection and actual protection is measured in destroyed sites, in losses that could have been prevented if agreements were honored, if heritage was valued enough to be safeguarded even during war. Some argue that human life takes precedence over heritage. That worrying about ancient stones when people are dying is misplaced priorities. The argument has surface appeal, but rests on false binary. We can value both human life and cultural heritage. can recognize that destroying heritage is also harming humans, is severing communities from their past, is erasing identity, is impoverishing future generations by denying them access to their inheritance. Heritage is not separate from human welfare, is part of what makes us human, is connection to those who came before, is evidence of creativity and faith and achievement that transcends the immediate and temporary. Destroying it impoverishes us all. The question of reconstruction arises. Could the temple be rebuilt? The documentation exists. The floor plans are preserved. Photographs show how it appeared before destruction. In theory, reconstruction is possible, but reconstructed temple would be copy, would lack the 3,000-year continuity that made originals significant, would be new stone trying to appear old rather than old stone bearing witness to millennia of survival. Some sites are successfully reconstructed. Warsaw's old town was rebuilt after World War II destruction and is recognized as legitimate cultural heritage despite being largely reconstruction. But reconstruction is never equivalent to preservation, is always compromise, is always acknowledgement that original has been lost, and this is best we can do to remember what was. The destruction of Ain Dara temple is final in ways that time's erosion never was. Time wore the stones but left the essential structure, left the possibility that future generations could encounter physical space as previous generations had, could stand where ancients stood, could trace footprints with their fingers, could experience architecture as tactile reality rather than as documented memory. The bombing ended this, ended the physical continuity, created break between before and after that cannot be bridged. The temple that stood for 3,000 years is now a memory, is documentation, is photographs and drawings and academic papers, is knowledge without presence, is history without physical form. We witness this destruction from distance, through screens and reports, through the mediation of news coverage and satellite imagery. Cannot feel the physical absence the way locals can who knew the temple as landmark, as part of their landscape, as familiar presence that oriented their sense of place. Cannot experience the grief that archaeologists feel who had worked at the site, who had documented it, who had plans for future excavation now impossible. Can only acknowledge from afar that something significant has been lost, that the violence of our time has erased what millennia of previous violence had spared. The destruction that came from the sky, the bombs that fell, the temple that shattered, the footprints buried beneath modern rubble, the 3,000-year story that ended on January 20, 2018, forever lost, forever testament to both human achievement and human capacity for destruction, forever the reminder that nothing is permanent, that survival across millennia guarantees nothing, that we are capable of erasing in moments what ancients built to endure forever, the destruction, the loss, the ending, forever. But loss is not absolute erasure. Destruction of physical structure does not equal total annihilation. Because the temple exists now in forms that bombs cannot destroy, exists in documentation, in photographs taken over decades of archaeological work, in measured drawings that captured precise dimensions, in scholarly articles that analyzed architecture and placed it in broader context of ancient Near Eastern temple design, in dissertations that examined the footprints and proposed interpretations, in books that described the temple for readers who would never visit Syria. The documentation preserves what physical destruction tried to erase, holds the temple in form that can be transmitted and studied and remembered even when stones themselves are broken. The photographs are particularly powerful, are not just records but are witnesses, show the temple as it appeared before destruction, show footprints in their basalt thresholds, show guardian lions still watching, show orthostats with their carvings intact. The photographs allow us to see what no longer exists to be seen physically, allow future generations to encounter the temple visually even though they cannot encounter it architecturally. The images are shadows, are two-dimensional representations of three-dimensional space, are captured moments rather than enduring presence. But shadows are better than nothing. Are testimony that something was there, are evidence that can be examined and studied even when original is lost. The measured drawings serve different purpose, are technical documentation, show floor plans and elevations and sections through the architecture, show dimensions and relationships between spaces, show how the temple was organized. These drawings allow reconstruction of spatial relationships that photographs cannot fully convey, allow understanding of how the temple functioned, how processions moved through chambers, how privacy and access were controlled through architectural design, how the progression from entrance to inner sanctum created experience of increasing sacredness through decreasing accessibility. The drawings are analytical, are attempts to understand rather than to simply record appearance, are scholarly engagement with the temple that continues even after physical destruction. The scholarly publications preserve interpretations, preserve the questions that archaeologists asked and the answers they proposed, preserve the debates about dating and function and religious identity, preserve comparisons with other temples that placed Ain Dara in broader context, preserve the accumulated knowledge that multiple scholars contributed over decades of study. This scholarly memory is not equivalent to the physical temple, cannot replace the experience of standing in actual space, but ensures that what was learned from the temple continues to be available, continues to inform understanding of ancient Near Eastern religion and architecture and cultural practices, continues to contribute to human knowledge even though the physical source of that knowledge has been destroyed. Digital archives now hold most of this documentation, hold photographs and drawings and publications in databases accessible to researchers worldwide. The digitization means the temple exists now in virtual form, can be encountered by anyone with internet access, can be studied without traveling to Syria, can be analyzed by scholars who will never visit the physical site. The digital preservation is not ideal, is no substitute for physical encounter, cannot provide the sensory experience of being in actual sacred space, cannot give you the feeling of standing where ancients stood. But digital preservation ensures that destruction of physical structure does not equal loss of all knowledge. That bombs can destroy stones, but cannot destroy information about those stones if that information has been properly recorded and preserved. Some institutions created three-dimensional digital models of the temple, used photogrammetry and laser scanning to create virtual reconstructions. These models allow exploration of temple spaces in ways photographs cannot provide. Allow viewing from multiple angles. Allow movement through chambers. Allow measurement and analysis. The technology is imperfect, cannot capture everything, makes assumptions where data is incomplete, creates representation rather than replication. But the models serve important purposes. Preserve spatial relationships, allow architectural analysis, provide educational tools, create possibility that future scholars will be able to study temple in ways that approximate physical study, even though physical temple no longer exists. The memory held in documentation is partial, is incomplete, cannot preserve everything about the temple, cannot capture the quality of light falling through chambers, cannot record the acoustic properties of inner sanctum, cannot transmit the feeling of standing before footprints and understanding their scale, cannot convey the cumulative weight of 3,000 years of survival that gave the temple its authority. The documentation preserves forms and dimensions and visual appearances, but cannot preserve presence, cannot preserve the quality that made the temple sacred rather than simply old, cannot preserve what can only be experienced physically, but partial preservation is better than total loss, is testimony to human commitment to memory, to refusal to let destruction be complete, to effort to save what can be saved even when most is lost. The archaeologists who documented carefully, the scholars who studied thoroughly, the photographers who captured images, the institutions that preserved documentation, all participated in ensuring that temple would survive beyond physical destruction. would continue to exist in different form, would remain accessible to those who seek to understand. The documentation is gift to future, is bridge across destruction, is way of saying that what was lost physically need not be lost completely if knowledge about it is preserved. We honor those who documented, who knew or should have known that documentation might be all that survives, who created the archive that allows the temple to exist now in memory and in scholarly record, who made possible our continued encounter with the temple even in its physical absence, the memory held in broken stone, the knowledge preserved when structure was destroyed, the documentation that outlives the documented, the archive that holds what bombing tried to erase, forever partial, forever insufficient, forever better than complete silence, forever the testament that we tried to save what we could, that we value our heritage enough to document it, that we create memory in forms that bombs cannot destroy even when bombs can destroy the stones themselves. The memory, the documentation, the preservation, forever holding the temple in form that endures, forever. The temple is destroyed, but the mystery endures, perhaps grows stronger in the aftermath of loss, because the questions remain even when the physical structure that prompted them has been reduced to rubble. Whose feet were these? What divine beings walked through the temple leaving footprints 1 meter in length? What myths explained their presence? What rituals honored them? What traditions preserved their memory across centuries until the final forgetting? We still do not know. Still cannot answer with certainty. Still face the same mysteries that faced archaeologists when they first uncovered the footprints in 1956. The destruction has not resolved anything, has only ensured that some answers will never be found, that the texts we hoped might be discovered beneath later layers will remain buried, that the evidence we thought future excavation might uncover is now mixed with modern rubble and will likely never be properly retrieved. The mystery was always central to the temple's significance, was built into its fabric from the beginning. The builders chose to construct around footprints they apparently did not create, chose to make these unexplained marks the foundation of their sacred architecture, chose mystery over certainty, chose to worship presence they could not fully explain rather than to explain away what they could not understand. The choice suggests something profound about ancient religious consciousness. Suggests comfort with uncertainty, suggests that not knowing was acceptable, that mystery could be sacred in itself, that divine presence did not require complete understanding to merit worship. Modern consciousness struggles with this. We want answers, want explanations, want to resolve mysteries through research and analysis and evidence, want to pin down what the footprints meant, whose feet they represented, what exact theological framework gave them significance. Our discomfort with not knowing drives scholarship. drives the search for texts and comparisons and contextual evidence that might resolve the questions. But some mysteries resist resolution. Some questions have no answers accessible to us. Some knowledge was lost when oral traditions ceased to transmit it and written records failed to preserve it. The mystery of Ain Dara's footprints may be permanent, may be something we simply accept as unknowable. The destruction adds another layer to the mystery. Adds the question of why sacred spaces that survive millennia fall to modern conflicts. Why heritage that has been preserved for so long is lost so quickly. Why the footprints that waited 3,000 years for interpretation are now buried beneath rubble created by violence that recognized no sanctity. These new questions do not have comfortable answers, cannot be resolved through research, require wrestling with contemporary realities about war and cultural heritage, and the value we place on preserving past versus achieving military objectives. The mystery deepens when we acknowledge that we destroyed what ancients preserved, that our violence exceeded their violence, that the temple survived every previous threat only to fall to ours. The footprints persist in mystery even in their physical absence. We have measurements, have photographs, have documentation that preserves their dimensions and positioning. But the documentation only makes the mystery more acute, because we can see that they were real, can verify that they were carved with precision, can confirm that they marked stride that suggests actual walking rather than symbolic representation, can study them in detail in ways that might not have been possible if we still had only physical access to them buried in temple chambers. But study does not equal understanding. Analysis does not equal explanation. We know more about what the footprints were, but remain ignorant about whose they were. Perhaps the mystery is the message. Perhaps the footprints were meant to provoke questions rather than to answer them, were meant to create uncertainty rather than to resolve it, were meant to remind worshippers that divine realm exceeds human comprehension, that some things remain beyond understanding, that approaching the sacred means accepting that you will not know everything. That faith begins where certainty ends. The ancients who built the temple around these mysterious marks may have understood something we forget. That mystery is not problem to be solved, but is reality to be acknowledged. That the divine is defined partly by its inscrutability. That what can be completely explained can be mastered, and what can be mastered is not truly divine. The mystery outlives the temple because mystery is not material, is not physical structure that bombs can destroy, is question that exists in minds of those who encounter the evidence and wonder about it, is the gap between what we know and what we want to know, is the space where curiosity and imagination and scholarly investigation all operate without reaching final resolution. The temple can be destroyed, The stones can be broken. The footprints can be buried. But the mystery continues. Continues in every photograph we examine. Continues in every scholarly article that proposes new interpretation. Continues in every person who encounters the story and asks, "But whose feet were they?" We carry the mystery forward. Carry it in the questions we ask and the uncertainty we acknowledge. Carry it in our refusal to pretend we know more than we do. Carry it in our acceptance that some knowledge has been lost and will not be recovered. Carry it in our wonder at the footprints, at their size, at their precision, at the decision to build temple around them rather than to explain them away. Carry it in our grief at their destruction and in our gratitude for the documentation that preserves them in memory, if not in stone. The mystery is inheritance, is what the temple leaves us even in its physical absence, is the enduring question that survives the destruction of the structure that embodied it, the mystery that outlives the temple, the questions that destruction has not erased, the footprints that remain in memory even though they are buried in rubble, the sacred uncertainty that persists beyond stone and beyond time, the unknowing that is itself a kind of knowledge that some things exceed our grasp, that some mysteries remain mysterious, that the divine, if it exists, does not reveal itself completely to mortal understanding. We stand in presence of this mystery. Feel its weight. Acknowledge what we cannot know. Honor those who worshipped at the temple even though they too may not have known all the answers. Honor the footprints that marked divine passage even though we cannot name the divine being whose passage they marked. Honor the mystery itself as sacred, as worthy of preservation, as valuable precisely because it resists resolution. The mystery endures. The questions persist. The footprints remain in documentation and memory. The wonder continues. Who walked through stone? What divine being left marks 1 meter in length? What myths have been lost? What knowledge died with the oral traditions that transmitted it? What did the ancients understand that we have forgotten? The questions spiral outward. Touch larger mysteries about ancient religion and human relationship to the sacred, and the limits of what we can know about past. The Temple of Ain Dara is destroyed, but the mystery it embodied survives. Survives in every question we ask about the footprints. Survives in our continued wondering. Survives in the sacred uncertainty that refuses to be destroyed even when temples fall. The mystery, forever, the questions without answers, the wholly unknowing, the footprints in memory. Forever asking, whose feet were these? Forever waiting in the darkness where mystery dwells. Forever the sacred question that outlives every answer and endures beyond every temple built to house it. The mystery, always, forever.